Welcome back, everyone, to Politico's AI Summit. Now, today we've heard a lot about AI policy in the EU and the US, but this panel is focusing on how AI is being developed in the Global South. Joining me today are André de Aragao Azevedo, Portugal's Secretary of State for the Digital Transition, as well as Esther Kunda, who is the Director General for Innovation and Emerging Technologies at Rwanda's Ministry of ICT and Innovation, and Rohit Satish, who is a consultant at Niti Aayog of the Government of India. Before we start, just a few housekeeping notes. Don't forget to submit questions via the Swapcard app, and please answer our poll, which is: when adopting new tech regulations, the EU should pay more attention to how they affect countries in the Global South. You can also tweet about this panel using the hashtag #PoliticoAI. Now, what I'd like to hear from both Rohit and Esther about how their countries are tackling AI and regulating AI. Ladies first, why don't you go first, Esther? What's Rwanda's approach to AI?
Thank you, Melissa. And thank you for having me at this incredible conference and summit. So I think just to go into Rwanda's journey into adopting AI, I can just go back into a few years back where we decided as Rwanda to become an ICT hub in Africa and work towards that. But also we make sure that as a small country in the heart of Africa, how do we become competitive globally and be at the forefront of the changes that we see in the technology space? So one of the main areas where we were looking at today is how do we see emerging technologies come on the market? How do we make sure that we are not left behind, but also we have the right regulatory environment to accommodate them, and as well as encourage the private sector to go into these sectors. So one of the key things that we've done with our strategy is have a proof of concept strategy where we've opened up our market to to innovators in different technologies that are new, especially in the sectors that interest Rwanda, like agriculture, health, and the finance sector. And here we really focus on emerging technology, whether it's drones, AI, etc., etc. But specifically on AI, one of the key things that we're currently doing, we're actually in the midst of developing a national AI policy, where we're looking at how do we as Rwanda include, develop the right skills, support, encourage AI in the public sector, but also foster the right private sector environment for adoption. Look at our infrastructure strategy around to support these new emerging technology and AI specifically, and as well as our data strategy. And here also in line with that, we also have a data protection and privacy law that is coming to be enacted in a few months, or in a short time. But other than that, I would say on the private sector part, in terms of what are the practical ways that we've worked on, we have a couple of things that are very impressive that we've done. We have an initiative called Digital Muganda. It's a private company that is really looking at AI infrastructure. And one of the key things that they've developed is really have Kinyarwanda voice data set. So Kinyarwanda is our local language. And I would like to say that on a global arena, we have the second largest voice data sets available for machine learning and for machine learning, etc. And this is second to English. We've seen recently with COVID, where we're trying, our Ministry of Health is trying to look at how to use AI to predict the spread of the pandemic, looking at developing chatbots, AI chatbots, to enable people to know and give them local news and guidelines and rules to understand what is going on with COVID. But it's still a very, very small industry, and we are looking at world-class universities like Carnegie Mellon developing specific programs for AI talent. So I think we're really, I would say we're starting with a very high speed to grow in this area, and we look forward to collaborating on a global level with developing an AI economy for ourselves. Thank you.
Great, super. Thank you. Now, how about India? What's happening with AI in India, right?
Yeah, so again, I would like to start off by thanking Melissa and Politico for inviting us here. The strategy for the work on strategy for artificial intelligence began back in 2018. And it started with the recognition of the fact that AI as a technology is extremely relevant for India, both in terms of the economic potential and from a social perspective. Right. So from an economic perspective, India has the third largest startup ecosystem in the world. And among the deep tech startups, AI has the highest share. 44% of deep tech startups leverage AI. And and especially if you look at the current context where we are as a country, we are looking to bounce back from the pandemic. Various industry reports show that data and AI have the potential to add from anywhere between 450 to 500 billion dollars to India's economy by 2025. Right. And even from a skills perspective, from the latest Stanford AI index shows that India has the highest AI skill penetration rate, and there's also a growing job market for the technology. So it's a very relevant technology for us from an economic perspective. At the same time, we are also cognizant of the strategy is also cognizant of the socio-economic situation in India. There is a critical need to improve health infrastructure. There's a need to improve the quality of health services, provision, inclusive access to services like financial services, education services, farmer advisories, infrastructure development, productivity improvements, and all of this needs to happen at the lowest level of the government. And we have the second highest population in the world spread across a wide spectrum of socioeconomic indicators. And there is a need for mechanisms that can deliver need-specific and customized solutions at the lowest possible level in an efficient manner. And this is something that AI provides, right? AI enables a mechanism to do this, right? And therefore, India's strategy for artificial intelligence focuses on ways to harness both the economic potential and the social potential. And inclusive growth, or what we call AI for all, is the main theme of our strategy. And in this regard, we've identified various enablers towards growth of AI, such as a dedicated fundamental and applied research for AI, along with need for compute infrastructure. There's also a specific role that's been outlined for the government in terms of guiding innovations by supporting ambitious long-term projects that we call moonshot projects, and also instituting clear frameworks for responsible AI, right, or ethics of AI, right? Specifically with respect to the social sector, because it's a market that the private sector does not have incentives to serve. The strategy has laid out a clear role for the government to procure and drive AI innovations in the social sectors. And towards this, 5 priority sectors have been identified, which is healthcare, agriculture, education, smart cities, and smart mobility. Right. So this is basically, in a nutshell, what our strategy is trying to focus on.
Great, thank you. Now, Andre, Portugal is currently the president of the Council of the European Union, and the EU has been pushing for a lot of international collaboration on AI. What's the EU's approach on AI and countries in the global south?
Well, thank you also, Melissa, for this invitation, and also let me greet Politico for this important initiative of promoting an AI debate through this Summit 2021. In fact, Portugal is holding the presidency of the European Union Council. And this is a great opportunity for us to promote this, the importance of use of digital in total alignment with our national strategy, because we have approved in the beginning of 2020 our national plan for digital transition, in which one of the relevant factors is exactly AI. Since 2019, we have in Portugal an approved national AI strategy that is supposed to define our main goals that we intend to achieve until 2030. And the idea is to have by 2030 a knowledge of intensive labor market with a strong community of forefront companies producing and exporting AI technologies, supported by an academia in a high level and also fundamental and applied research. This is what we intend to achieve in 2030. Because we do consider that AI technologies are supposed to be easily available to promote the efficiency and the quality of all activities, including SMEs, public services, and every citizen. And so the objective is to have a labor force that is highly qualified and position Portugal at the forefront of AI education for all. From your question, I think it's clear that what should be the main general objectives that we intend to achieve. First of all, make sure that all these countries, and especially the southern countries, can add economic growth to their economies, can promote and boost their economies through the incorporation of new technologies. We want also to achieve scientific excellence, improving the frontline position in fundamental and applied AI research of the Portuguese and international academia, as well as to reach a very significant human development, basically increasing the qualifications of our labor force. We are aware that we still have a way to go, we still have a gap that we need to fulfill, but we have a very strong reskill and upskilling process ongoing to make sure that we can cover this kind of gap. I would highlight some good and important examples of AI applications in Portugal, some of them very similar to the ones in Rwanda. I'd like to also greet my colleagues of panel. And in fact, our health sector was one of the most relevant areas in which AI has been more successfully applied. For example, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, we have a very strong startup ecosystem that were able to develop significant solutions that helped us in the controlling of the pandemic. So I would highlight, for example, a specific tool for controlling public spaces based on AI that allows an automatic count of the number of people that is present at an event and immediately react and issue an alarm if we reach to the maximum capacity of a room, or for example the use in the public services of chatbots and speech-to-text technologies that basically allow companies and public entities to provide a much more efficient and more personalized response. I would also highlight the use of AI in the context of the climate challenge. In fact, we do believe that technology and the climate agendas must go together. There's what we call the twin transition, and sustainability, obviously based on, for example, intelligent mobility, or optimizing our energy efficiency, or the water use is great examples on how AI is bringing and adding value to our economies, to our business models, and to our public services. And obviously, during our presidency of the European Council, we will pay specific attention and importance to this topic. So we are collaborating in the new strategy, European strategy, that is already under preparation, and that will be the standard that the global of the 27 member states will be committed to and ready to implement in the short term.
Great, thank you. Now, one of the EU's ambitions is to create a global standard for AI, but as we know, some of the harms of AI, people in poorer countries or in the global south often suffer disproportionately from these technologies. And well, my question to you, Esther and Rohit, are: do you feel like your voice is being heard in this global debate around AI standards? Why don't you start, Esther?
Thank you, Melissa. So I think on that conversation, there's different layers on how you can look at it. One, as a country, we also have first to aggressively be included in the conversation, develop the talent that is needed, and make sure that we are part and parcel of creating the AI economies around the world that we want to see. But on the other hand, one of the things that is very critical to understand is AI is really based on data sets. It's based on data from across the world, and we've seen the pervasiveness and how fast different technology solutions can spread across the world. And with AI solution, one of the caveat or the part that is really very harmful is what data sets are we using to train our AI algorithms? What are we really going ahead and developing the right data sets across the world? I think this is one of the most fundamental questions that we all have as a global economy. We have to be conscious about and be very clear about. If you're developing, especially in healthcare, in the justice sector, in most of these social areas, how are you being fair in terms of the data set that you're collecting everywhere? So mostly in most African countries, we're building most of our data set, making it available, but it's really being cautious about the fact that the solutions that are being developed may not have or are not trained on the right data sets. So how are you developing the systems, and how we go ahead and make them either mandatory or use them in different regulatory environment is going to affect people most people in our countries if it's not considered. And this could be either coming from whether it's different races, it's different people from different countries, or across genders, and all that. So there's different, it all depends around what data sets are you using. But on the other side also, there's the regulatory side. Again, because technology now has become very global, something that is developed in Europe can be used and used in Rwanda the next day without any barrier. So any sort of feedback or harmful way of going about this is going to affect the people in Rwanda. So are we looking on the regulatory side? Are we being cautious about it? I don't know. I don't have quite a good answer around it, but I think it's really, this is somewhere I would say for EU regulators and policymakers to understand the pervasiveness of these technologies and how they affect global markets, the global population in general. So I think the first problem is the data that we're using. The second is when you're regulating, understanding that you're regulating for the world. It's not only for a small geographical region. When you're regulating AI solutions, the digital economy, essentially, you're regulating for the world. And we have to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Now, Rahid, what do you think of what Esther just said, and to my previous question as well? Can the EU become a global standard?
Yeah, I completely agree with all the points raised by Rwanda, and I think she also covered a lot of points that I wanted to make as well. So I'll just sort of supplement to what was said earlier. And in our strategy, when we develop our strategy, we are very cognizant of the fact that it is not possible to take isolated approaches to developing any standards and frameworks, and that is where we have been in touch with say, international organizations and bodies that are creating such frameworks like the GP, the Global Partnership for Artificial Intelligence, and UNESCO has done some work on responsible use of artificial intelligence, and our responsible AI framework is mostly in agreement with the international frameworks as well, right? But at the same time, we must ensure that the strategy that we develop reflects the priorities and needs of our country, and and towards that, while some countries talk about regulating AI, so in terms of, if we just look at the responsible AI part of it, while some countries talk about regulating AI, our strategy is also talking about how can responsible AI be enabled in the country, right? And what measures should government take to enable responsible AI? Like, for example, um, the earlier speakers also mentioned about chatbots and and the issues and the need to publish data sets there, right? This is specifically a problem with India because India has over 1,600 dialects across the country. And if any AI system has to reach everyone, and if we are looking at an inclusive growth, then natural language processing capabilities become that much more important. And currently, the NLP is limited, right? The capabilities of NLP is limited, right? And what can government do to enable that? Right. And another, as was pointed out, is one is just the data sets for fairness, and another is to think about what fairness would actually mean in different countries, right? Like for example, in India, there is the concept of reservation for marginalized communities, right? So those aspects have to be taken into account when you are thinking about fairness, right? And also, if you consider all of those factors, then what would be a reliable proxy for the entire to identify various subgroups to make sure whatever models you develop is fair, right? And you're looking at and you're also looking at population that does not have a digital footprint as of now, right? And if you're trying to reach that population, how do you get the data for such population, and how do you enable AI systems for such populations, right? And that is where government has a role as well, because government for its own operations collects data across a wide socioeconomic spectrum. And can such data be made available to the public in a safe and safe manner that also protects privacy of individual citizens? Right. So these are some of the considerations that we take when we try to come up with our standards and frameworks. And this is something that again we believe is lacking in the literature in general, because the literature largely reflects the Western idea of what fairness is and what how AI models should define. And there is a need for some dedicated thinking and research, right, around what such responsible AI frameworks would even mean in other countries. So yeah, so this is one of the perspectives that we've brought in our approach.
Great. Thank you. Now, Andre, I'd like to ask you our poll question. So when adopting new tech regulations, should the EU pay more attention to how they affect countries in the global south?
When adopting new tech regulations, the EU should pay more attention how they affect. Well, I agree that we have a particular responsibility. Europe as a whole has created a certain expectancy from other countries and regions in the world. There is this strong commitment from Europe that is on the basis of our own project of European Union, which is a very strong ethical commitment that obviously must also be transposed to what is the development and application of these new technologies. When we look into the main stakeholders in the digital world market, we think about US, the China or the European Union. each one of them with very different profiles. We agree that in the case of Europe, despite we are somehow underpowered, we consider our tech sector a little bit lagging behind. But at the same time, we have a strong ambition as a rule maker, a policy making, because we can, for example, recall here the example of GDPR, in which Europe was in the first moment when it announced its intention of regulating privacy and creating a new standard. It was criticized for the fact that could somehow be an objection to development and innovation. But in fact, at the end of the day, it resulted in a new world standard that was very relevant for the protection of the privacy and personal data of each of the citizens of the world. And this is something that is a great example that we should replicate at a different level. What we also call the Brussels effect, which is basically the capacity that the European Union still has to define rules and to set standards and requirements on the cars industry, chemicals, food. Basically, they have been adopted all around the world. So it's what we can call a regulatory process that will play a large role in shaping the global digital economy. And this is exactly what we also want to achieve during this digital assembly that is starting tomorrow in Portugal. In fact, this is a very important event in terms of digital agenda and the European calendar, because it's about discussing the future of Europe from a digital lens. And what we want to reinforce is exactly that strong commitment of Europe with the ethical dimension, and to make sure that Europe can work as a beacon of digital democracy, aiming to promote at the same time to support the European digital sovereignty, but also solutions for the 21st century. And we believe that we can claim that positioning, because other regions, other geographies look to Europe with very high expectancies. When they look into Europe, they expect to find what we got used to call the European way of doing business, which is exactly making sure that there is this strong ethical commitment and this mutual respect with other regions in the world. And so in our Lisbon Declaration, we intend to approve for the first time what is an international digital principles framework that will be relevant and will define an initial scope that we expect will evolve to a Charter of Digital Rights in the future. This will be the kickoff of that process. It will be the Lisbon Declaration, and we will also have attached this strong commitment in terms of a new cycle for international cooperation. We assume that we should invest more, but we should invest more in a smarter way, in a more efficient way, supporting developing countries in their own digital process of evolvement, and making sure that we are creating conditions for retaining talent on those countries and regions, to make sure that the application of digital technology in all our countries and regions is made in an ethical and cooperative way. And so I do believe on the role that Europe must play on this process. And when comparing to the approach of other superpowers like US or China, we assume our challenge, but we are extremely committed in playing our role, and to make sure that we are working for the benefit of all of us, and to make sure that we have a safer, a fair, and inclusive digital environment as a whole to the world.
Great, thank you. Now, Andre mentioned investments and talent retention to developing countries. Now, Esther, is there anything else or something more you'd like to see from a Rwanda-EU collaboration?
Thank you very much. I think in terms of collaboration, as Rwanda, we've invested we're investing heavily in AI. Whether it's through our partnership with WEF on a Center for Fourth Industrial Revolution that is essentially focusing on AI and implementing projects in AI, or through our research initiative or talent initiatives. So really from the EU, one of the things that will be very interesting is to collaborate on whether it's on talent, whether it's on skilling, high talent, collaboration around that, collaboration on developing the private sector around AI, but more importantly, on regulations. How do we harmonize regulations between Rwanda, but Africa at large, and the regulations within the EU region? So I look forward to exploring those conversations, both on investments in startup scene here in Rwanda, but also in skills, and lastly on a regulation again. Thank you.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you're adopting a new data protection regime. Is that, by any chance, similar at all to the GDPR or inspired by it, perhaps?
So really, our constitution our constitution first gave us the right to privacy. The right to privacy as a citizen. So we've built on top of that, but of course we've benchmarked global best practices, including GDPR. So that's what we've done. But this is one thing that was already, I would say, that was already enshrined in our constitution from the get-go. So now it was understanding, how do we, in this new, in digital space, in the digital economy, how do we go about this? And we benchmarked, of course, best practices, GDPR, and other laws, different laws that are available.
Great, thank you. Now we have just under 5 minutes, and I'd like to take an audience question. Marlena Wisniak is asking she wants to know a bit about the role of EU companies selling surveillance technologies to many countries in the global south, and how this impacts vulnerable groups. I know there have been reports of a Dutch company who's doing this in Africa. How much of a concern is this for you, Rohit and Esther? Why don't you start, Esther? Have you had these cases in Africa, for example? Sorry, go on.
Okay, so probably I haven't researched that, but not at the moment.
Oh, I think we lost you there. Well, Rohit, why don't you jump in?
Sure. So, okay. So specifically with respect to face recognition technology, again, I'll go back to some of the previous points that we had made. That it's difficult to ascertain reliability, right? Whether this face recognition technology is reliable or not, right? Primarily because if you look at the most popular databases that are there, right? Say the ImageNet database, the Open Images. If you look at those, there is a clear lack of representation of South Asian communities, right? So ascertaining reliability is difficult. And towards that, it's not just, I mean, there's no simple answer to that. And the approach that we've been following is to sort of guide the procurement of AI technologies in general, right? So what should, let's say if a public sector organization wants to procure an AI system from anywhere, right? We need to have some sort of a capacity building there to ensure that they recognize some of the responsible AI considerations, that some of the ethical considerations that would come up, and also supplement that with certain frameworks that they can use to evaluate individual AI applications. Right, so it's a little difficult for us to it's a little difficult for us to just give a yes or no answer to AI applications in general. So we are working on more of what modality should be there around procuring AI solutions, and we hope if we institutionalize such modalities in the public sector, then such risks and consequences of AI would not, the negative consequences of AI will not happen in India.
Great, thanks. Now, Andre, the EU is very adamant that certain uses of AI, such as surveillance and social scoring, those uses aren't allowed in the EU. But how can it avoid European companies exporting those technologies abroad?
Well, it's difficult to have a direct response and clear response to that question. Obviously, European companies are obliged and are binded by the European legislation that is particularly demanding in what refers to the protection of individual rights and also to privacy, to data privacy. It's, as I mentioned before, Europe has set a new world standard in terms of privacy, and obviously European companies, even when they are working or selling abroad or exporting services, they are supposed to be binded by those criteria, by those principles, and by those by that objective of respecting and protecting individual rights. So if we compare to other geographies in which there is a more flexible approach, and the examples like the ones you mentioned are possible and are in fact already in place, it's something that we do not want to replicate inside European borders. Obviously, we don't also want it to be replicated in any place in the world. So we expect our companies to be up to the European standard and make sure that they are not doing abroad what they are not allowed to do in Europe. Having said this, of course, the world and each country has its own regulation. When an European company or an American company reaches to a market in which there is a lack of regulation, it's easy or it's possible, if they don't have the right principles and the right level of ethical commitment, that they can assume that they are not binded by the same principles, and they can develop or take part in process and projects that don't safeguard this kind of concerns. But we expect as well, like happened in the GDPR, that in terms of on every single aspect of implementation of technology, we are able to set this standard and make sure that every single country adheres to these kind of principles and concerns.
Great, thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you to all of you for this really interesting conversation and panel. And for you viewers at home, don't go anywhere. Our next session is going to be fascinating. It's going to be about AI and misinformation, and it's going to be moderated by my colleague Mark Scott, and it's starting in just a few minutes, so stay tuned. And thank you again, all three of you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.